Hello, hello, hello. Greetings, friends. We are so grateful that you have decided to join us today for Thursday for the Soul. Welcome to everyone. And I've enjoyed watching the chat, seeing people coming from all over and beginning even to form community there before we begin. I am Tracy Blackman. I am Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries here at the United Church of Christ and your host for today. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series for the entire church. We faithfully focus on care and education for the people of God and create opportunities to digitally worship together as the whole of the United Church of Christ. From prayer, music, and psalms to interviews of key leaders and how-tos in congregational life, this series stays current to the relevant topics of the time and offers opportunities of connection in the wider church and in the community and in the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. We made a change in 2022. For those of you who are frequent visitors with us, you already know this, but for those who come occasionally, we went from 2 times a week to 1 time a week to create space for grace, knowing that you are returning to some things and growing back into new things and may not be able to connect as frequently as when we began, but we want to keep the connection. Friends, if these are conversations that move you, if what's offered here helps enhance your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC at 41444. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs like these in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you, and thank you in advance. Before we get to today's session, I want to tell you a little bit about what's coming up in the series, and I want to do that because I know when Dr. Chisholm starts that we will not have the opportunity to do it afterwards because of your interactions. Thursday, March 17th at 3:30 in this same space, Contemplatives in Action, Mindfulness in the UCC will be the topic. Following the Contemplatives in Action resolution passed at the 2021 General Synod, a working group of clergy and students and lay leaders have been meeting regularly to pray and meditate on how to incorporate more contemplative practices in our UCC communities. The Christian tradition is rich with stories from those direct experiences of the Holy Spirit, but many find the more esoteric side of spirituality to be intimidating or inaccessible. We are here to tell you there's so much more to meditation than silence, friends. Join us and expand your mind. On Thursday, March 24th, at the same time, same place, we will have Preparing for Youth and Young Adult Summers. Join members of the UCC National Staff and faith partners to learn about some of the exciting opportunities that are available for the summer 2022 season for youth and young adults. It's never too early to begin planning. Now for our topic today, Midwifing Grief. The Reverend Dr. Jamie Eaddy Chisholm is a healer, a dreamer, a theologian, a thanatologist. I had to look that up when I first started dealing with her. A poet and a friend. She has served the congregation as a local church pastor and the community in several ways. An ordained minister, a chaplain, an adjunct professor, a loss navigation specialist, a death educator, an activist, and a death doula. Regardless of the title, what Jamie is most concerned with is healing, the healing of people and the wellness of community. And she does that in a lot of ways, but primarily she does it by helping us learn how to navigate loss and grief. Her work sits at the intersection of theology and thanatology, and she incorporates art and music and movement when providing care. She supports patients, families, staff, and community members during some of life's most challenging and distressing circumstances. And I've been following her for a long time and found her work to be deeply helpful. And I don't want to say cutting edge because it's odd that we haven't been here for a very long time, but understanding death as a part of life is something that even we in the church wrestle with. So I'm so grateful that you said yes and that you came to be with us today, Jamie. And I know that the audience will have plenty of questions. I will be checking the chat as we go. And if I miss you, please put your question in the Q&A so we can have an engaging conversation together. I want to confess, Jamie, starting out, that I hastily titled this webinar Midwifing Grief, and as a nurse, I should have known better. But the ministry you have been called to provide for so many of us is really the role of an end-of-life doula and not a midwife. For me, the primary difference in those roles is that a midwife accompanies the birth process and doulas accompany the person who is having the process. You self-identify as an end-of-life doula. What does that term mean to you?
First of all, thank you for having me here. And I'm glad we're having this conversation. An end-of-life doula or death doula, some might use the term death doula, is one, as you mentioned, who accompanies people through this process. Typically for me, it's grief and end of life or death. And what that means really is that I provide emotional, spiritual, some practical support. I help people, I affirm people's dignity. I help people have conversations around fears associated with taking their last breath. I sit with people in their grief and in their pain and their disappointment, sometimes helping them find meaning, sometimes not, but I'm there for the journey. I help families with practical matters, helping them figure out what the next steps are, whether that's burial or cremation. I help with that part as well. But mostly I'm sitting with people in the pain, the confusion, the joy, the challenge of preparing to take their last breath. And I'm there for the person, but I'm also there for their family and in some cases, community.
So I think you know already, Jamie, that I'm a nurse. And as I hear you talk about that, what comes to mind for me is hospice, right?
Yes.
But oftentimes hospice doesn't have a death doula. So I'm wondering what those intersections are, how that plays out.
Yeah. So hospice, well, first, most hospices don't want death doulas today. They prefer to have their social worker and their chaplain. And in some ways, a death doula does meet at the intersection of what perhaps a social worker might do and a chaplain might do as well. I do work with some hospices, and it's a matter of finding the space for the work that the doula does. For example, I served as a hospice chaplain, and often when I went in as a hospice chaplain, some of the questions that may have come up during end of life, some of the spiritual questions that folks may have had toward the end of life, I could sit with them in those places. But my time was limited. My time was limited because typically hospices have so many patients on the roster and you're spending time with a number of patients. As a death doula, I am not necessarily constrained by time. So I may sit and work on meaning, having you explore or helping you to explore that you mattered, right? That let's go through your life and let's find this thread of value through your life. I can sit with you for 3 hours. I can do that kind of work with you. Whereas in the hospice setting, I was unable to do the more meaningful work. And I'm not knocking hospice. I love the work that I did with hospice, but I'm able to go just a little bit deeper with people as a death doula and really explore the meaning of life for them in their own way. I work on projects with people. Like, how can you be remembered after you take your last breath? What might your family want to do to celebrate your life? And I can help them dig deep and think about poetry and art and music and other ways that they can celebrate their life. But it's really my ability to sit a little bit longer with the person so that we can get to the heart of the matter. And I don't know that I was always able to do that when I served as a hospice chaplain.
I see affirmation of your comments in the chat. Donna is saying that she's a hospice chaplain and she does those things you mentioned, but she agrees that sometimes time is limited. Recently, my best friend died, and because of COVID, I was able to answer her call to come and be with her in what I call the thin space, right? Which is incredibly holy, incredibly holy. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But it's strange that as people of faith, we are well acquainted with the life cycles, and yet we often struggle with death, right? In the pulpit and in the pew, we develop various coping mechanisms. And sometimes if you are a minister, you're trying to balance that with the life cycles that are happening in your personal life, as well as what you're doing with other people, right? And so some of our coping mechanisms are helpful, and some of them may be harmful, and some of them may simply just be ineffective, right? To help us navigate through grief. So what are some of the helpful ways we might accompany our own grief and the grief of others?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I encourage people to do almost immediately is to pause, right? We have been going almost nonstop for some for the past couple of years. And even if it's not just the past couple of years, work requires us to get up and go. And then we're coming to our homes and we're still on the go. And we very rarely pause long enough to really just acknowledge the loss. And part of this for me is that death is not just the death of a person, that dreams die and aspirations die. And we have these other deaths and losses that we're dealing with. So I encourage all of us to pause and to name the loss. Sometimes just naming the loss, naming your grandmother, naming your best friend, naming the dream that you saved up for that fell by the wayside, sitting and giving voice to it is one of the ways that helps us cope through and navigate our grief. But in addition to that, it is making sacred space for emotion. In some faith communities, every emotion is not welcome, and not just in faith communities, just this is across the board. Every emotion is not necessarily welcomed. So what does it look like to acknowledge sadness and to sit with your sadness, not try to push it away, not try to make it something else? What does it look like to just sit with sadness for a moment and allow the sadness of the moment to sort of run through you? What does it look like to acknowledge that you're angry at the loss of the person that you loved or the thing that died? What does it look like to just name your feeling and to actually feel it instead of trying to put another emotion in its place? Often we want to push the sadness out and, put in this place joy and victory. And this is not to say that I am not one who wants us to experience joy, but the sadness has its place as well. So besides naming and acknowledging the loss, being able to connect with and say how I feel. Is there space for me to say that I'm angry, that whether I believe God or someone took my loved one, is there space enough for me to do that without judgment? And when somebody can just sort of sit with me in that for a moment, as I explore, as Spirit speaks, as I cry, whatever the case is. So feeling our emotions and having sacred space for that. But the last thing I would say, and there are a lot of things, but the last thing I would say is developing rituals that help us process the grief and process the loss. So during the early stages of the pandemic, I was serving at the hospital. And at one time, doors were closed. So the only person in the hospital when somebody was taking their last breath usually was a nurse, a doctor, and or a chaplain in that space. And I'm using my cell phone talking to family while I'm holding their loved one because they can't be in the space. Often when we are near our last breaths, family, whether chosen or biological, might be by our side, might be at our bedside. And that's part of the ritual. That's part of the ritual of sitting with someone. And we took that away, not intentionally, but that was removed from people. So what else can I do that would be meaningful for me when I can't do some of the things that I was used to, some of the things that helped me process the loss, like having funerals, right? Like having memorial services. What else can I do? Since I can't do that thing, is there something else that I can imagine that would allow me to process in the same or similar ways as the things that I was so accustomed to doing before? And so naming, connecting with emotion, and then finding some rituals that allow us to express feeling and meaning are helpful ways to process our grief. And then always be with community. Grief is personal, but it's also communal. It's individual, but it's also universal. You don't have to grieve alone, though. So sometimes we think we are the only ones who feel a certain way. Knowing that there is a non-judgmental, sacred community that you can sit with during those times can be helpful. And then for those of us who are welcoming in those who need this safety, who need this refuge, not trying to fix it, not trying to silver lining it, but just being willing to sit in the dirt with somebody with tears, without an answer, right? Without the answer, but just being present. We call it the ministry of presence, but being present with, can we do that? Those are some of the helpful ways that I have found have helped people process and navigate their grief and loss.
That's really helpful, and I'm trying to keep up, y'all. So if you have a real serious question, put it in Q&A because the chat is going by really quickly for me. I'm going to touch on all your spaces today. So yes, to all of those things you just said, yes. And in the context of ministry, and when I use the term ministry, I don't necessarily mean the pulpit. And I don't necessarily mean ordained ministry. Those who feel a call to minister to others. What are some of the ways that our theology does us a disservice around preparation for death, right? For some, right? I saw in the chat, some people say that they talk about death often in the church, but how do you theologize this work that you do? And I'm gonna say, and I might lose my preaching card for this. The resurrection is the most powerful part of our story. But in some ways, the resurrection suggests that death is bad. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just saying, in some ways, right? And I'm suggesting that, I'll just leave it there. Are there ways that our theology is impacted?
Yeah, that first of all, that last thing you said was so powerful for me. Is this belief that death is bad and that we want to do everything we can to fight death, to win against death, almost as if death is the opposite of life, but it's not.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that we have positioned death against life when death it's part of life's journey, right? You're born, something is born, something is produced in it, something dies. But even in the death, and you talked about resurrection, positioning death against life is one thing. And then not having enough conversation around some of the beauty that is possible through death, through transition, or through change, is another, I think, challenge in our faith spaces. That for some things to grow, a certain kind of death is required. It is a part of the process of moving forward, of growing. And I think we can do a better job in having that kind of conversation in the faith space. Also, for people who believe that there is a place that they are going after they die. So they're taking their last breath, and whether they call it heaven or paradise or something else. I'm always curious about why we have positioned death in such a way that even though we believe we know where we're going, there's still this this resistance to continue that process, right? And I know no one wants to die. No one wakes up today and says, I want to die today. But there is so much that we can do to make death a part of our life conversation and not make death the antagonist, the thing that is against our life conversation. And I think the faith space is the perfect space to do that.
I agree. And I see some agreements happening in the chat as well, and people who are wrestling with how to talk about this in the church, right? And I often ask myself, is it the death that bothers me, or is it my grief of loss, right? Which are different. I'm learning to embrace death. I'm learning to walk with people without requiring that they try to live.
Yes.
So, and you've been a great help to me in that, even though you don't know it. I read everything you put out. You've been a great help to me in that. I want to talk a little bit about, so we're in this place contextually, we're emerging from more than 24 months of pandemic isolation, right? At least we think we're emerging. We're doing pretty good right now. But we've lost over 1 million people to COVID. And we often focus on that 1 million people from COVID, but meanwhile, we had people dying from other things too.
Right.
And dying with the absence of our rituals, dying with the absence of our communities. So many people that you can't even post them all in the newspaper. I just buried someone who spent 234 days of her last 249 days in the hospital with COVID. So these are not even cases that people talk about, right?
Yeah.
And so even with that, Jamie, death is not the only loss we must navigate.
Right.
And I like the fact that you called yourself a loss, navigating loss as well as death, right? Acknowledging that. So I know you serve congregations. What do you say to people who are coming back together and who are navigating, yes, the loss of death, but also the loss of
everything else,
people? Who we were when we left is not who we're going to be when we come back, not in our family reunions, not in our churches, not in our neighborhoods. There's a loss of people. Some died and some just ain't coming back, right? Loss of ritual, loss of tradition. What would you offer into this space to share with us about ways of self-care and ways of care of others as we navigate all of these losses simultaneously?
Yeah.
Someone called it trauma. I think that's a good word.
Absolutely.
And says trauma of the past few years.
It is certainly trauma. And I'm glad that you named a couple of losses, a couple of different kinds of losses. The truth is that every day we are encountering some kind of loss, some just a little more meaningful or heavy than others. And so you mentioned the death of our loved ones, but the death of support, perhaps because people lost jobs, right? So it's a loss of job, which also might mean the loss of security, right? Which impacts your relationship with family, perhaps. People entered in 2020 with hopes and dreams. Some saved all their money because this was going to be the year that they started their business or their church. And here it is, January 2020, and things started well. February, they still going well. March, what just happened, right? Another loss. There are relationships, people, not just death, but separations, divorces, people feeling like they're losing a sense of themselves because everything that they were accustomed to doing and being before, it was not available for them. And so we are entering, or perhaps re-entering, into these faith spaces with all of this loss combined. First thing is, in that faith space, we need to acknowledge that loss goes beyond just the death of someone that we love. Because if we're only looking at it from the death of a loved one perspective, then we're going to miss a whole lot of people, and we're going to miss a whole lot of what people are carrying. So there was a faith community that I worked with, and what we worked on was a service for their re-entry into the sanctuary. And in that service, we acknowledged all of the loss that we had in that time, that was 2021, that they had encountered in 2020. And people were writing down names, they were writing down jobs, they were writing down dreams, they were writing down relationships, but they had to give voice to the losses and not rushing people to victory, not rushing people to get over it, which is something that I've also found in several faith spaces. Is sort of, we have the victory, let's praise our way out of it. Well, there's a place for praise, certainly, but there is absolutely a place to acknowledge, to sit before God and lament what we no longer have. And so I encourage people to do just that, to name and acknowledge and lament the losses, but be able to really name your losses, like to sit with all of what you've lost. Because it's deep if you really just sit with and think about beyond the people that were no longer here, beyond the funding that you didn't receive. Some people weren't touched for a year. What does it look like to not be touched for a year? What kind of loss does that have on your mental and emotional and physical health? So we really need to really sit back and think about all of the losses, the kinds of losses that people have experienced, and open up our space for people to mourn and to lament. But I always keep saying this, to name. So whatever naming looks like for you, if it looks like giving everybody flashcards so that they can write it out and bringing it to the altar, then that's what we do. If it whatever it looks like, giving people space to name those losses is going to be critical in our processing of our grief. If we're unable to name it, then we may not be able to grieve appropriately. So those are some of the things that I would say as we re-enter this sanctuary, and get help. Like, pastors, I know y'all are busy. I know it. I get it. And I know that you couldn't do the things. You couldn't show up for Big Mama when she died because they didn't let you in the hospital either. And she was a member of the church for 50 years. I understand that. You too are dealing with your loss. You need to do the exact same thing. Steal away for a moment so that you can pause, get some assistance if you need it. Therapy is not out of the question. Do what you need to do for you, because the same thing that we're encouraging the congregation and community to do is what we need to do for ourselves, especially because we're trying to usher people through their grief and their loss.
Amen. Amen. I've been talking about that in terms of, especially when we thought we were going back and then we didn't go back and then we thought we were going back, and people have this image of just this wonderful celebration, and I do believe in the resurrection, but the resurrection requires Good Friday, right? And so there has to be that time of sitting in mourning and grief. I want to take some of these questions because they're really good. One of the questions that someone wants to know is, how do you become a death doula? Is there a specific training for that, or is that chaplaincy on steroids, or
Right.
what's the
Yeah.
process?
So there is training to be a death doula, but let me say this to everyone. Um, for generations, our people, whoever your folk have been accompanying people who are near end of life, right? So even as a death doula, what I am doing is not necessarily new work, right? I recognize that not everyone is going to enter into this space as a death doula, but some of what I do, we all have in us if we pause long enough to recognize it. But yes, there is training. I'm the director of program development at INELDA. So INELDA, they have training, but there are several other training organizations. The thing is, as a death doula, similar to how birth doulas and midwife started, there is no birth doula started, excuse me. There is no national certification. So there is no insurance reimbursement. Therefore, there, even though you're certified by an organization, anybody can certify you, to be quite honest, right? But you want to go to a reputable organization that has history in training people to do this kind of work. And there are a few out there, but somebody wrote in the chat, love an elder. So yes, that's one that I would recommend because I'm there, but there are others as well.
So what does the train, because I will confess to you, Jamie, that I love the job I have now. And I hope I have it for a while. But my dream job was to help churches navigate death.
Yes.
And that sounds so morbid, right?
No,
but
that's it.
I think that churches get caught in the grief of the cycle of life of churches, and whether that is death of, as in the church is closing, or whether that is death as in what we have always done has to be laid to rest so that we can do something new. I've always thought that churches needed doulas for that, right? To help them part with rituals that no longer serve us, part with traditions that no longer serve us, part with theology that no longer serves us. And so when you train to be a doula, I get that there's a certification, I get all of that, but what is it that you're doing? What is it that you're doing in this training?
Well, first I'll say, yes, I've helped churches. Churches absolutely need doulas to help deal with the death that they might live again. In this training, depends on where you are. We talk about, you look at the signs and symptoms that are associated with the end of life process. And so what is happening to your body and perhaps even to your mind, and how to accompany that person and family through it. You may learn about listening, because all of us hear well, I shouldn't say that. Many of us hear, and some of us hear well, but not all of us are listening in wonder and curiosity. Often we're listening to respond to something that someone says. And so we practice, right, listening. And that's why it's even good to have a mentor after you go through the training, so that you can continue to do this kind of work. We practice listening because it's really important what people are saying, what they're not saying, and maybe how their bodies are moving as they say it. We look at what you might do to help people explore their life story, their narrative. What was your life like? And that's not how you ask it in that way, but some people are looking for, at the end, did I matter here? Did I matter? And so let's explore your life so we can say you mattered. Even if we don't explore your life, I'm saying you mattered. But let's sit down and unearth some things. There might be some regrets that a person or churches want to explore. We train people how to sit with those difficult conversations, with someone talking about how their childhood may have been filled with abuse, and they need to get that out of them in those moments so that they can transition into this next life, whatever that next life will be. So that's some of the kind of training that we do in the doula training. And then we work on creative things. As I mentioned, what can we do for this person if they're gone, when they're gone, that is a remembrance project. And for some families, I know I had a family who the grandmother was a chef, was a chef at home, right? Didn't have a restaurant, but everybody knew that you went to her house for the meals. Well, let's get our recipes together. She had some of them scribbled down. We put a nice little recipe book together, and they made a cookbook. And this was done. Understand this was in the height of the pandemic when the family couldn't be together. So we met on Zoom and we figured out how to get the recipes together. And the oldest grandchild got everything in the computer, printed everything out, created a recipe book, and then mailed out the recipe book with pictures of family and meals to everybody in their home, well, to the older folks in their homes. And this is what they did. They decided the day after she died that they were going to have a meal together. But guess what? It had to be on Zoom. But what they did was each person picked a recipe from the newly created recipe book, and they made that meal and they sat down together. So, and that sounds simple. So this is why I tell people that all of us can walk with people toward the end of life. I'm a death doula, but I also help people navigate grief too. So there are some nuances to the work too, but to sit with somebody at the end of life, we can help you pull out what's already there that makes you more effective as you sit with your family or loved ones.
Susan mentions in the chat that the AIDS memorial quilt was a way of doing that at the height of AIDS, when could make those panels and send them in. And I once attended a workshop. I had only seen this happen in Islam, right? That it probably happens for other people. I know it happens in Judaism too, but in a different way. That if someone's dying, the family comes, gender specific family comes to the deathbed, and they actually bathe that body before it leaves, and they sing to the body and they oil the body, and it's a very sacred and holy place. And there are people who make death kits for death baths and things like that, which I think could be very helpful. I want to go back to something you said, because I want you people to know that you can do this right now. This listening exercise that Jamie is talking about is so important for the living and the dying. Somebody say amen. We need to learn how to listen without anticipation of response. So often when I do workshops, I ask people to get in pairs, a listening pair, right? And there's a question, and you respond, and the other person is just listening. When it's their turn, they can't comment on what you said or ask you anything. They tell their own story. And I invite you to practice that with people, because it will help you learn to be in the moment with people instead of being in your mind waiting to say what you have to say about it. It's just so important, so important. So Donna wants to know, how do you market this? How do people come to know that there's a type of service as a death doula? And is it usually accompanying hospice care, or do you get calls to just accompany people outside of a formal process?
Right. So it's a mix. Hospice, typically, most hospices do not refer you to death doulas. Most of death doulas are referred to by word of mouth, because it is still new, if you will, right? It's still something that not everyone knows about.
Like
so it's really
practice,
right. Yes. Yeah. And that's how I liken it. It's the person in the village, in the community, that knows how to do this work. And so when somebody is sick, they say, hey, oh, you know what? Call Jamie. She might be able to help you all in whatever, right, the thing is. So part of that is word of mouth. Doulas do have private practices. So thoughtful transitions is a practice. And so people start their own businesses and they have websites and do marketing, do workshops and webinars and other trainings. So same way you would anything else. The thing for me that has been helpful is that because when I started doing sort of death doula work, sitting with people as a death doula, I realized that there were a whole lot more things that were dying that people need to talk about besides perhaps themselves or their family member. And I started looking at loss, and I figured out that my role was as death doula, but also as someone who can help people navigate loss. And that is something that whether you are near end of life or not, again, it's still sort of word of mouth. But more churches now are starting to reach out because they recognize the kind of losses that their church is dealing with, and bringing people in who specialize in sort of loss navigation and helping people process this. So word of mouth, websites, all that kind of thing. And comedians are getting a hold of this. Other people are getting a hold of this death doula thing. And so they're putting it out in the mainstream. So you'll hear more and more about it over the next couple of years. I expect it to be everywhere.
I also want you to speak to a couple of questions. I'm going to put them together because this is village life, and I think my beans are burning, so I need to go cut that oven off.
Oh gosh, yes, yes.
But so there's a question from Geneva about how do you work with people who have dementia or Alzheimer's at the end of life? And that's an important question because that impacts the family differently, right?
Yes.
I'll be right back, y'all. Keep talking, okay?
So let's talk about that. So first of all, let me say this, Geneva and everyone else who's listening. At ANELDA, we are developing our course for doulas, specifically for doulas to accompany people at the end of life with dementia or Alzheimer's, right? So we train the folks who are coming through to work with people with some things that you should know very specific about the disease, right? So how does this disease impact the person with dementia or Alzheimer's? How does this impact their ability to communicate? Are there ways that we might communicate that are more helpful? Perhaps rhyming. Does rhyming help with getting across certain ideas to the person who has dementia, right? Does rhyming help? Does movement help, right? Or sometimes you might have a chart and you're pointing at things. What are the ways that are most helpful for the person with dementia? But then we're working with the family on navigating loss and grief, because we know that the way you are on Monday in March, or today is Thursday rather, Thursday the 10th of March, may not be the same you on the 17th of March. It may not be the same you on the 12th of March. And so helping them deal with the what we call sort of anticipatory grief, right? They are seeing the person change before their eyes. How do we help them process that grief, but also be present for their loved ones? So yeah, there are some specific things that we can do to help doulas in the space of dementia for the dying person, but also helping the family process their grief as they support the dying person as well. So there are some trainings for that. As I mentioned, there's rhyming work. There are some things that we will help you, very specific things, because each disease might be different, right? If someone is dying from a certain kind of cancer, that might impact their body and mind very differently than someone who has dementia. And so yes, we work on some subtle differences when you're trying to work with families as well. Not every place does that, but yes, that's something that we do at ANELDA.
So Marilyn Pagan Banks has a question for you, and it's an important one.
That's a good question.
Because we've largely been talking about death as the cycle of life, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes the cycle is interrupted.
Interruption, yeah.
By violence, by poverty, by lack of access to care. And so she says, I believe this type of death is contrary to I came so that you can have life and life more abundant. What do you do with death when it may not be God's plan,
Yeah.
right? It may not be that this is just the end for you.
Yeah.
I just eulogized a 29-year-old, um, a young woman who lives with me right now. Her brother just um, was killed in Chicago 4 days ago. And she needed to stay here, not needed for me, but she needed to stay here in my home until I got home because she needed me to hold her before
Mm.
she went to hold them. Um, it's just how grief works for some people, right? So he's 26 and shot 12 times, emptied the revolver on him. And so, what how do you navigate those spaces for those of us who choose, and I do choose to walk with people in those kind of places? Where is the role of the deaf doula in that?
Yeah. Yeah. Whew. I just, as you were talking, I'm seeing other faces in my head of life interrupted.
Mhm,
Um, First, I make space for the anger and the
mhm,
pain. You make space for this, especially in faith spaces, not trying to rush people to a place of forgiveness, not trying to rush people to a place of, everything is in God's hands and God wouldn't put more in you than you can be. The things that we say to people, right, that typically not accurate for me anyway, but not pushing people in the place um, to be joyful or to sort of accept that this is where they are. Like, you don't have to be happy about this death. We can sit in the anger and the frustration for as however long you need to sit in it. I think sometimes we want people to be angry for a moment and then we're like, okay, now it's time to move on. No, as a death doula, I come in and one, acknowledge the disparities in access, acknowledge the disruption to, often Black lives, acknowledging that in the system, with the people whose lives are being disrupted, being present, not shying away, and then giving them again the space for holy rage, for righteous rage, for anger and frustration. But also being willing to sit, because even that loss is connected to somebody else's death or another loss. And so often, if you sit long enough in those kinds of spaces, you get to unearth some of the heaviness that people have been carrying for years. Um,
mhm,
and I can be a container in that moment with you, a safe space to hold you, like you mentioned, and that, so that
mhm,
you can, at least in this moment, maybe get up again. It doesn't mean that it's fixed. It just means that it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be in this broken space by yourself. So as a death doula in those spaces, I am just sitting, acknowledging, I'm also um, feeling the same kind of sort of holy and righteous rage that you feel. One of the challenges is, and very candidly, um, more mainstream death doulas typically are white women,
mhm,
and you can't enter into every community um, telling people how to die or things like. You have to, sometimes you have to be part of the community to enter in and to be present, um, and address the inequities that are present in that community, but you got to know about them as well. And so
mhm,
that's how I serve the community. Is one, I know about the access issues and I'm fighting just as you to get the access. I'm sitting with you in your holy and righteous rage and anger and not trying to push you past it. I'm allowing you to address God however you need to, if you do in that moment, and not trying to get you to be okay with what happened and where God has you in your life, where we can sit in the very real space that is disrupted life. And so that's how, as a death doula, I enter into those spaces.
I want to affirm that, Jamie, and also say I had to learn that I don't have to have something to say. I want to say that to anybody who is walking in that space. There is a ministry of presence that
Mhm.
is more powerful than most of what you have to say if you don't know what to say, right? Just being there is ministry. Just sitting in silence with someone, just letting them be. There's a ministry of presence. Marissa's asking the question, do you think we need a theology of murder versus natural death? I think she's reaching for is, should we be adept at talking about those things differently? Is it okay? I mean, when I preached that 29-year-old's sermon, I said, God did not need another flower.
Right.
God didn't need anybody in heaven. You know, this isn't because God was finished with him or he was finished with God. God is with us wherever we are, in life or in death. So that's a ridiculous notion to me anyway. But I acknowledged, and I'm angry. I'm ministering to you, but I want you to know I'm angry about this, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like God can handle that. God can handle our questions. God can handle our anger, right? So do we need a theology around interrupted life?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, where anger can be present and not rushed, where questions can be raised that we don't necessarily have the answer to, where even if you feel like you're shaking your fist at God, and I'm, be mad at me, folks, but that's okay. Like that, the theology of murder, as I'm hearing her question, is our ability to say, this was not God's design for this life, right? And I am going to acknowledge the many lives that are disrupted, that are not by God's design. And I would speak about that kind of process differently than I speak about the process of someone, perhaps a natural death, someone who was not shot, did not have 20, a clip emptied into them. Those types of deaths are spoken about differently, and the way we process them is going to be different, and we need to make space for that. We really do need to make space for that.
Jamie, this may have to be a part 2 because we have like 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And there are lots of questions for you. And I want to get to this last question I wanted to talk to you about, because there's a different part of you that I think is connected. Jamie is also a poet, and I don't know if I said poet when I was describing you. And I've read your book. I have your book, Getting Naked to Get Free. And some people may not see a connection in that book and this deaf doula work that you do, but for me, it was a great connection because it deals with matters of incest and matters of bodily sacrifice and bodily abuse and sexual violation, right? And with these things comes death. It's not natural death. It may not be a physical death, but
right.
Death is involved in that, right? And so the poetry that you write in there, for me, is about. I heard the poems as death and resurrection stories. Not the easy risings that we often proclaim, not the angel rolling away the tombstone and the folk waiting outside to heal you, not that kind, but the kind where you have to claw yourself out of the dirt, right? To get that breath of air. I was blessed by this book, and I want to share with all of you that if you are interested in her book, Getting Naked to Get Free, she hasn't written the Deaf Doula book yet. I'm offering 50 of those to the first 50 people who put in the chat your information, and you can send it just to the host if you want to. You don't have to share your information with everyone, but send your mailing information. The first 50 of you will get a copy of that book. But can you talk to us a little bit about the role of resurrection in loss, the role of resurrection in loss? Let me tell you, we need more than your name though, because you have to give us your address and everything, or we won't know where to send your books, babes. So give us your name and your address. Amen. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, and based on, because of the way you asked the question, I'm going to use part of the poem to talk about this. The poem Sleep Without Sleeping deals with a young girl, and it's a life story, right? That not everything is about me, but that one deals with the sexual violation of a 6-year-old. And at that moment, something in that 6-year-old dies, right? Some, maybe some possibility, some imagination, some dreams, something or some things die. Continue to live, and we're encountering other losses, but perhaps even other violations, which is a different kind of loss, and something else is dying. And so you are becoming, or I was becoming, but still carrying some dead weight with me, right? For me, the process was, there's a piece in the poem where I talk about, let me go back, where I say I had to go back to me in order to resurrect Jamie whole, right? Because I had left pieces of myself every time I was violated. Whatever kind of loss we've experienced, we may have left pieces of ourselves if we didn't process the way we needed to process. And there's a part in the poem where I say, I told that 6-year-old that it wasn't your fault. I told that 13-year-old that you didn't have to go to the clinic alone. I told that 20-year-old that you're special just the way you are. I told that 27-year-old, you don't have to hide who you are, just be the best you. And I told that 30-year-old that you've come a long way, but you still have some work to do. And I told that 35-year-old that it's okay to smile, to cry. That doesn't mean that you're week. And I told that 36-year-old to go and get herself some sleep, because I had learned to sleep without sleeping, right? And I'm gonna stop there. But the resurrection for me in that piece came from going back to the places where violation or loss occurred and processing in that moment, right? So I had to go back and process as the 6-year-old and process that loss. I had to process as whatever the age is that you all have encountered some violations and losses that you tried to press your way through, but didn't get a chance to process properly. When we get that chance to process properly, it is like we are being reborn, because we can reconnect to places in ourselves that have been dead for years, places we start to rediscover. You start to discover new things about yourself when you're able to go back to the places where loss has prevented you from being your authentic self. And so resurrection is certainly a part of this grief and loss process. When we are able to sit with the loss long enough to process, it allows us to be reborn, renewed, revived in ways that we probably wouldn't have imagined if we didn't go back and face, which is difficult. And I know we could do that for part 2, and face the trauma, the loss, the death, right? The facing it is difficult. And sometimes that's why we continue to move forward without processing. But if we would go back and process, I'm telling you, we would find out some new ways of being that allow us to live whole and healthy lives.
And I want to say as we close, Jamie, that I think that is true no matter the death.
No matter the death.
No matter the death.
That's it. That's the lesson.
We sit with it. If we sit with it and not try to fix it, just sit with it, we find new ways of being. Everyone that I love that has died is with me.
Is with me.
And awakens new parts of me, right?
Yes.
So connected. Someone put in the chat, it's going so fast, I lost all the names, but I read the comment that said, you have to do number 2 because we didn't even talk about music and therapy animals and all the other things that you can use. So we will have to continue this conversation. It has been wonderful, and I'm glad that we finally got to do it.
Yeah.
And Jamie and I have talked about doing something even more expansive for the United Church of Christ. But I also want to let you know that Jamie does this work on her own website. And if you'll just share with them about your website, and then close us in prayer, because we just want you to get what you need, right? We're planning to do something around a larger component of grief and loss, and Jamie would be a big part of that. But in the meanwhile, there are courses, and I know I've seen them before. I don't know if you do them all the time, but I've seen courses that you've offered online around grief.
Thank you. Thank you. The website is thoughtfultransitions.org, and I'll put that in the chat as well. And we work with individuals. So I do grief navigation with individuals. And I, just to be honest, for Black clergy women, there is a special rate. I'm just saying it because I'm a Black clergy woman. So I do grief sessions and loss navigation sessions with individuals, but I also do them with churches and organizations as they want to process, and they bring us into a Zoom room, or for businesses, helping them process change so that they can be a thriving business. But all of us have to deal with loss, whether it's individuals or groups. So thoughtfultransitions.org is the way that you would find me there. And thank you for that. And thank you, Claudette Peterson, who works with me at ANELDA. Those who want to come through training right now, go to anelda.org. Claudette Peterson is one of my instructors there. She's put that in the chat as well. So thank you, Claudette. Anelda.org. So Thoughtful Transitions and anelda.org. And thank you for inviting me to pray. I think we'll just have to do everything else on part 2 whenever we get together and do that. And so whatever your prayer, yes.
Denise, I just want to answer Denise.
Okay.
This webinar will be available for you to view at any time you want to view it. And when you get your thank you for being with us, it will tell you how to do that. You can watch it as often and send other people to watch it. You can't download it because I am mindful of people's intellectual property. It's hard out here. But they can come here and watch it, right? So it's available. That's the purpose of this. And is there an email address where we can contact Jamie? I would say that you can contact her through Thoughtful Transitions. I hope.
Yeah. Yes. On the website, it'll be contact me. Yep. Yeah.
Just contact her there. Yes, engage, because this is the work that's going to be so necessary for us to grow back from where we are now.
Yeah, grow back.
Jamie, if you will close the title of the book again. Y'all keep asking me questions. We got to go because we over. The title of Jamie's book, is that what you're asking?
I think so. Getting Naked to Get Free.
Getting Naked to Get Free. Getting naked, and that's in every sense of the word. We have to get naked. The Bible says we have to get naked to get free, actually.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I know it takes a lot. We are deeply appreciative. If you'll close us in prayer.
Yes. Gracious Creator, loving God, we are gathered virtually. And really in this moment, just pausing to acknowledge the deep heaviness and the loss and the grief and the many losses and the whole lot of layered grief that we all have been carrying over the years. We trust that you will guide us to safe spaces where we can process, where we can sit in our sadness without judgment, where we can be angry and loved, where we can have someone sit and listen and be comfortable in silence with us. God, we thank you for those who are called to this kind of work. And now for every person who is gathered virtually, every person who will watch on the replay, I pray that you would meet them in their grief, that you would meet them and guide them to a place that could be a healing balm, something that soothes the pain. May we all learn how to process in ways that are healthy so that our days ahead, we can become new in our authentic selves. This is our prayer. Lord, in your mercy, hear, answer, and send your healing. Amen.
Amen. Bless you all.
Siblings in Christ, if you were moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.